He made his choice before he even had time to think about it. That was the part nobody understood, not his supervisor, not the HR manager who processed his termination the following morning, and not the security team that watched the whole thing on camera and said nothing. Arthur Meade made his choice the way most decent people make the choices that define them, without calculating the cost. It was a Tuesday in late November, the kind of evening that arrives in Calgary like a warning. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees since noon, and the parking structure beneath the Holloway Tower smelled of wet concrete and exhaust. Arthur was finishing his shift, third one in a row that had run long, checking the heating units on level 2 when he heard it. Not a voice, exactly. More like the sound of someone trying very hard not to make a sound. He set down his tools and followed it. She was against the far wall near the stairwell, crouched between two cars, one hand pressed flat against the concrete pillar and the other braced across her stomach. She was wearing a wool coat that looked expensive and shoes that looked entirely wrong for the weather. Her briefcase was on the ground beside her, contents half scattered where it had fallen open. She wasn't crying. She was breathing through her teeth, very deliberately, the way someone does when they've decided that crying is not an option, and they are holding that decision together with both hands. Arthur crouched down to her level. He didn't touch her. He said, "Hey, I've got you." She looked at him, really looked, the kind of look people give when they're trying to decide quickly whether to trust a stranger, and said, "I think it's early." "How early?" 3 weeks. "Okay." He picked up her briefcase, gathered her things back into it, and snapped it shut. "What's your name, Sylvie?" A pause, a breath. "Sylvie Marchetti, Arthur Meade." He stood and offered his hand. "We're going to the foothills, that's the closest. Can you walk to my truck?" She could barely, with his arm to lean on. He got her to the elevator, through the lobby, where the evening receptionist looked up, and immediately looked back down at her phone, and out to the service lot where his truck was parked. He helped her in, turned the heat all the way up, and pulled into traffic on 16th Avenue without stopping to tell anyone where he was going or why. He thought about calling it in. He thought about it for about 4 seconds, and then he thought about the way she had been breathing against that pillar, and he kept driving. The hospital was 22 minutes away. She didn't speak much. He didn't fill the silence with noise. He found a parking spot near the emergency entrance, helped her inside, and waited until a nurse had her. And then he waited another 15 minutes until a second nurse came out and told him she was stable and being assessed. "You family?" the nurse asked. "No," Arthur said. "Just the person who drove." He was back at the parkade by 10:30. His supervisor, Ken Ferris, was waiting for him in the service corridor with the look of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and intended to say all of it. "You left your post." "I did." "You took a civilian in your personal vehicle during shift hours." "Yes, you know what the policy is." Arthur did know what the policy was. He had read it, years ago, when he'd first started, and he had thought it was a strange policy for a company that marketed itself as a community-oriented property management group. But he had read it and signed it and understood that it existed for liability reasons, and he had never had occasion to violate it until tonight. She was alone, he said. Her contractions were less than 8 minutes apart. Ken Ferris looked at him without expression. "That's not our responsibility, it's mine," Arthur said. There was a pause. "I'm going to have to write them," Ken said. "I know." Arthur went home that night and didn't think about it much. His daughter, Lily, she was 14, all elbows and opinions, and a seriousness about her schoolwork that reminded him constantly of her mother, was still awake when he got in, sitting at the kitchen table with a history textbook open and a mug of tea going cold beside her. "You're late," she said. "I am. Everything okay, yeah." He hung up his coat. "Go to sleep." She did eventually. Arthur stood at the kitchen window for a while and looked out at the backyard, which was dark and frosted and quiet, and thought about the way the city looked from the upper levels of the Holloway Tower, all grid and light. and how the woman in the parking garage had held herself together so carefully, like someone who had learned very young that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. He found out he was terminated at 9 the next morning, when he was called into the property management office and handed a letter. The letter used the word liability 4 times. It used the word protocol 3 times. It did not use the word reasonable or the word human even once. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and shook Ken Ferris's hand, which seemed to surprise Ken Ferris considerably, and he went to clean out his locker. He had been with Holloway Property Group for 11 years. Arthur Meade was 51 years old. He had grown up in Red Deer, trained as a mechanical engineer at SAIT, and spent the first decade of his career in industrial maintenance before his wife, Caroline, got sick, and they moved back to Calgary to be closer to her family. After she died, 7 years ago now, when Lily was 7, he'd taken the job at Holloway because it was stable and the hours were predictable, and he had a daughter to pick up from school. He was good at it. He understood buildings the way some people understand language, intuitively, structurally, with a feel for where the stresses were and where things were likely to give way. He was not a man who talked about himself. He was not a man who asked for things. And he was not, by any measure he understood, a man who expected fairness from institutions that had already demonstrated they didn't know what fairness meant. He spent the first week after his termination doing maintenance work for neighbors on a cash basis. A leaking pipe here, a furnace calibration there. Lily knew something was wrong within 48 hours and asked him directly, the way she always asked him things, without apology or preamble. "You lost your job." "I did. Because of the woman in the hospital." He had mentioned it briefly the night it happened. He hadn't thought she'd connected the timeline so fast. "The policy is what it is," he said. Lily looked at him for a long moment. She had her mother's eyes. "That's not an answer, Dad." "No," he agreed, "but it's what happened." He applied to 3 positions in the first 2 weeks. Facilities director at a mid-sized office complex in Beltline. Senior maintenance technician at a hospitality group in the Northeast. An engineering consultant role that was technically below his qualification but paid consistently. He heard back from none of them, which was unusual. Arthur had never had trouble finding work before. His references were excellent. His record prior to the letter was clean. He didn't know, then, what had been said. What had been said in a follow-up call between Ken Ferris and the HR contacts at 2 of those companies was carefully worded but sufficient. Something about Arthur's difficulty following procedure. Something about a pattern of unilateral decision-making. Nothing that could be characterized as defamatory, because Ken Ferris was not a stupid man, just enough to make a hiring manager hesitate. Arthur found out about this later. Much later. By then, other things had changed. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon, 5.5 weeks after his termination. He was in the garage recalibrating a neighbor's snowblower when Lily appeared in the doorway holding his phone out to him. "It's a woman," she said. "She said her name is Sylvie Marchetti. She said you'd know who she is." He did know. He wiped his hands on a rag and took the phone. "Mr. Meade." Her voice was different from what he remembered, clearer, less strained. "I've been trying to find you for a while. The hospital gave me what they could, but they only had your first name. How'd you find me?" Plate. "It took longer than I'd like to admit." A pause. "I owe you an explanation for why it took so long. My son was in the NICU for the first 3 weeks. I wasn't in a position to do much of anything except be there with him." Arthur said nothing for a moment. "Is he all right?" "He is now." Another pause. "I'd like to meet with you if you're willing. Not to thank you. I mean, yes, to thank you. But there are some other things I think we should talk about." He agreed to meet her the following Monday. He'd looked her up by then, of course. Sylvie Marchetti was not difficult to find. She was 44 years old, had an MBA from the University of Toronto and an engineering background from McGill, and had been the chief executive officer of Marchetti Cross Development Group for the past 6 years. Marquette Cross was a real estate and property development company with projects across Western Canada and a portfolio that included. Arthur confirmed this with a specific and focused calm. The Holloway Tower, along with 11 other commercial properties managed under the Holloway Property Group umbrella. He sat with that information for a while. Then he went and made dinner for Lily, who was working on a chemistry lab report and needed someone to quiz her on the periodic table, and he didn't say anything about it until after she'd gone to bed. They met at a small restaurant near the University District, neutral ground, a Tuesday lunch crowd that was quiet enough to talk. Sylvie Marchetti arrived 2 minutes before he did, which he noted and respected. She was dressed simply. She looked like someone who had been through something significant and was still in the process of reconstituting herself on the other side of it. She stood when he came in and offered her hand. Her grip was firm. "I want to start by saying something that I should have done a better job of saying sooner," she said, once they were seated. "What happened that night? You stopped what you were doing, and you got me to the hospital, and you stayed until you knew I was okay. My son was born 40 minutes after we arrived. The doctor said that if labor had been allowed to progress much longer in the cold, there would have been complications, serious ones." She met his eyes. "You kept him safe. I need you to know that I understand that," Arthur said. "I'm glad he's doing well." "His name is Elliot," she said. "He's 4 kilos now. Was 2.8 when he was born." "That's good." There was a pause. She poured water for both of them. "I also need to tell you that I didn't know, when I started looking for you, that you'd been terminated. I found out about 2 weeks into my search." She set the picture down carefully. "When I found out, I had my legal team pull the full file. I've read everything. I've reviewed the camera footage from that evening. I've spoken with Ken Ferris." Another pause. "And I've spoken to the hiring managers at the 2 firms where follow-up calls were made." Arthur was quiet. "I want to be honest with you about what I felt when I read that file," Sylvie said, "because it would be easy for me to frame this as straightforward. Man does right thing, gets punished, CEO fixes it. But it's more complicated than that. The liability policy exists because of incidents that happened before my involvement with Holloway. And until that night in the parking structure, I had never personally encountered its consequences." She paused. "I was the reason the policy stayed in place. Not because anyone told me to keep it, because I never questioned it. And someone who operates the way you did, by instinct, by principle, in a situation I had helped create, lost 11 years of standing because of it." She said it plainly. She didn't soften it or package it as a lesson. Arthur found he respected that more than he'd expected to. "What I'm offering you," she said, "is not charity. I want to be clear about that. I'm offering you a position. Director of Technical Operations for the Holloway portfolio. It's a role we've been trying to fill for 8 months, and we've interviewed 14 people, and none of them have the combination of practical knowledge and," she paused, briefly, "integrity that the job actually requires. Your resume and your references are exceptional. The only thing that has prevented you from being considered was the circumstance of your departure, which I am in a position to correct." He looked at her for a moment. "Why didn't you just reinstate me to my original position?" Sylvie Marchetti almost smiled. "Because your original position was below your qualification. It's taken me 6 years of running this company to understand what I should have understood in year 1. Which is that the people who keep a building functioning are not interchangeable. You were doing a senior technical role at a technician's salary because it was stable and it fit your schedule. That's not something I want to perpetuate." Arthur looked out the window. A transit bus went by in the gray November light, throwing up a small wave of slush from the gutter. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, Ken Ferris. What happens to him?" Sylvie was quiet for a moment. "He's been moved to a non-management role. That's already done. I considered termination, but what he did was technically compliant with the policy as written, and I find it difficult to fire someone for following a rule I maintained." She paused. "The policy has been rewritten. The new version includes a humanitarian exception clause. It's being implemented across all properties. Arthur nodded slowly. He thought about the 11 years. He thought about the morning he'd cleaned out his locker, the weight of the keys he'd handed back. He thought about Lily at the kitchen table, asking him questions he hadn't fully answered, and the careful way she'd stopped asking after a while, not because she didn't want to know, but because she understood that sometimes her father needed things to be quiet. "I need a few days," he said. "Take them," Sylvie said. "There's no pressure. I mean that." He took 4 days. He walked Lily to school on Friday and they talked about the chemistry lab, which had apparently gone well, and about her plan to try out for the spring debate team, which she'd been considering for 2 months, and had finally decided was worth the risk. She didn't ask about the meeting. She had her mother's patience along with her mother's eyes, and she seemed to understand that he would tell her when there was something to tell. On Saturday he drove out to Nose Hill, which he did sometimes when he needed to think, without the shape of the city pressing in on him. He stood on the ridge for a while and looked north, where the land went flat and pale and enormous, the way it did in all directions if you got high enough to see past the buildings. He was 51. He had a daughter who was going to be smarter than him in approximately 18 months, and was, arguably, already kinder. He had spent 11 years doing good work in a building that had never fully seen him. He had spent 5 weeks feeling the particular frustration of a man who has always played by the rules, discovering that the rules were written by people who'd never had to. And, on the night it had mattered, he had made his choice in 4 seconds without consulting any rule at all. He called Sylvie Marchetti on Sunday evening. "I'll take the position," he said, "but I have conditions." A pause. "Go ahead. My schedule needs to accommodate school pickup and drop-off. I have a 14-year-old. She comes first, always. If there's ever a conflict between a meeting and her, the meeting moves. I've agreed. I want to do a full audit of the technical staff across all Holloway properties in the first 3 months, not performance reviews, actual conversations. I want to understand who's doing what the paperwork doesn't capture." Another pause. "That's a substantial undertaking. It's what the job requires." "Agreed," she said again. "And I want the humanitarian exception clause in writing before I sign anything. It's already drafted. You'll have it tomorrow morning." He was quiet for a moment. "Your son," he said. "What did you name him?" "Elliot James," she said. "James was my father's name. That's a good name." He started on the first Monday of December. The office was on the 14th floor of the Holloway Tower. His building, the one he'd spent 11 years in the walls of, the one where he knew every pressure variance in every heating line and every quirk in every elevator system. Standing in the elevator on that first morning, riding up to a floor he'd only accessed in his old life to perform repairs, he was aware of the strangeness of it, the way a familiar place could suddenly arrange itself differently around you if you were standing in a different spot. The administrative assistant, a composed and efficient woman named Dorothy, who had been with the company for 15 years and seemed to have already decided she approved of him, handed him a building access guest card and a coffee and said, "The technical team is meeting at 9. They know you're coming. I told them to be honest with you. And will they be?" Dorothy considered this. "The good ones will." They were. Most of them. He spent the first 3 months the way he had told Sylvie he would, not reviewing files but talking to people. The electrician who had been flagging the same overloaded circuit in the Beltline property for 14 months without a response. The property manager in the Northeast, who had been quietly covering maintenance costs out of her own operating budget because the approval process took longer than the problems. The HVAC technician, a young man named Ray Dominguez, who had more practical knowledge in his hands than half the engineering contractors the company paid significantly more to consult. Arthur wrote everything down. He brought it to Sylvie Marchetti in a clear, detailed report with no recommendations attached. "Why no recommendations?" she asked. "Because I wanted you to read the problems first," he said, "before anyone tells you what the solutions are." She read it over a weekend and came back on Monday with a list of her own questions that told him she had understood exactly what he was trying to show her. By spring, 3 of the flagged properties had undergone structural reviews. Ray Dominguez had been promoted. The approval process had been restructured, and Arthur Meade was attending a parent-teacher conference for Lily, who had, in fact, made the debate team, and who was, in fact, better at the structured argument portion of the evening than most adults in the room. When his phone lit up with a message from Sylvie that read, "Elliot smiled for the first time today. I thought you should know." He showed Lily the message in the car on the way home. She read it and handed the phone back to him. "So everything worked out," she said. "Most things did, because you didn't leave her there." He pulled onto their street, the familiar row of houses with their porch lights on against the dark. "Because I didn't leave her there." Lily was quiet for a moment, looking out the passenger window. "Mom would have done the same thing," she said. Arthur parked the car. He sat with that for a while in the quiet of the cab, the heat ticking down, the streetlight making a pale square on the dash. "Yeah," he said, "she would have." They went inside. Lily had a debate prep session to finish, and he had a facilities report to review before morning. The house was warm and small, and theirs, and outside the temperature was dropping again in that way it did here, sudden and complete, the way the prairie took back the warmth it had briefly lent you. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen table with the report open in front of him, and the window dark, and the sound of Lily upstairs, reading her arguments aloud to herself, testing them for holes the way she'd been taught to do. He thought about the parking garage, the cold concrete, the sound of someone trying very hard not to fall apart. He thought about the 4 seconds it had taken him to decide. Some decisions don't feel like decisions at all. They feel like the only thing a person who is still who they are could possibly do. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the world arranges itself, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable delay, into something that looks almost like it was listening,